So we're just going to start with how did you get into rowing? I know that it was kind of once you got to Drexel, but what other sports were you playing ahead of that?
Yeah, so it's a little unusual, my circumstance in the sense of I didn't get introduced to the sport until my senior year at Drexel University. I had been involved my entire life in organized sports, and I knew when I went to college that I didn't want to be involved in something organized anymore. I kept up the running and got involved in, co-ed fun sports, but I got involved my senior year at Drexel University simply because that summer prior to, I had worked in New Jersey Shore at the beach, and I kept having people say to me, "Do you do crew?" Now in Pittsburgh, we didn't have the sport, so I didn't know what they meant. I'm like, "J crew, what do you mean?" Um, and so it wasn't until I got to Drexel University that fall that I started to see signs literally all over the campus, join crew. And if that's not like a sign from the universe, I was like, maybe I should look into it. So yeah, that's how I got involved in it. And I literally fell in love with it the first practice, mainly because in my family and the DNA, we all love water, whether it's an ocean or a river, a stream. We gravitate towards nature and water. So it was a natural fit to me.
And then what was your conversation with the coach kind of pitching your ability because you hadn't, this was a new sport for you?
Right. I'm a novice and I'm pretty much clueless on that there's rowing after college, aside from what I saw on Boathouse Row. I would see working professionals row in the morning and then they go to work. Some would come back later, or they row at night and work during the day. So that's all the extent that I knew. But to the credit of Mamie Doyle, she was the one who said to me, we should submit your scores, your rowing machine scores, and then there's a weightlifting test as well. And to send it to the US governing body because there's a pre-elite summer camp going on. And she wanted to see, like, if I get accepted to it. And to her credit, for a female who's already was actively involved in the elite level of rowing, not just as a coach, I really applaud her in approaching me um, and offering that, because she could have just brushed it off. She didn't have to do that. So it's a testament to her core, just how confident she was as a female, as a woman competitor, to say, let's just send them in. So she sent them in and I got invited. And because Drexel works on a term system, so it's a 10-week term system, the first semester or term doesn't start till mid-September, which means then the last term doesn't end until mid-March. So I knew I was going to miss graduation, which was fine by me because the idea of sitting in a stands in the sweltering heat of Philadelphia, it did not appeal to me. I had my diploma literally mailed to my mother. I said, just mail her the diploma. I got invited to the camp and I went literally to Chattanooga, Tennessee, right after finishing my last exam. And I was encouraged by the psychology department, I should add as well, because they heard about this opportunity. And they said, yeah, you should do it. You should go. And so I thought I was just going to go for the summer and, improve upon my rowing skills. I knew that there were people that had been rowing since the 9th grade in high school. I knew I was still very new into the sport, obviously. So I didn't put a lot of focus on it, aside from, oh, this will be a great activity to do the rest of my life. And it's something I can do while I'm working, because I could already see there are a lot of passionate individuals that were rowing all the time throughout the day, particularly the summer months. And another thing that attracted me to the sport was I would watch these elderly people with their walkers go down the actual ramp at the boathouse. And this is along the historical landmark Boathouse Road. There are a number of boathouses there, all of which were built in the late 1800s. So that tells you sort of the timeline. But I would watch them go down into the boat, and you could see their spirit light up once they were in the boat and out rowing. to the best of their ability, rowing technically how they could, right? So I knew that was like, oh, I'm an athlete. I think I could really get into the sport because it's something I can do later on in life. So that was sort of my whole viewpoint at that point in time.
A lot of the athletes that come on this podcast are team sport athletes. And what I find is that we end up talking about the same thing, and that topic is athlete identity.
Mhm.
You align yourself with the sport and have since you were, for gymnasts, some of them 4 years old, 5 years old. Team sport athletes are slightly older, but regardless, these are sports that once you get to your mid-20s, normally you have to stop.
Right.
And rowing is obviously not like that. So was that one of the factors that just overwhelmingly drew you to rowing specifically? I mean, tennis works like that, golf works like that. I guess rowing joins that club.
Well, again, I was of the mindset that I would be occasionally competing, mainly in Philadelphia, and that I would just be able to continue. Yes, I could continue to do it, throughout my lifespan. There's what's called there's a master's division, and that's age specific, and each race is organized according to an age bracket. So say, 40 to 45 or 40 to 50. I don't know them specifically because I've never been a master's rower, and those age brackets are significant because then that determines sort of the expected time frame for these rowers to actually complete a race. It's very realistic and very strategically set up. There's a scientific formula. So, but when it comes to elite level rowing, so that's the people that are choosing to attempt to earn a berth on the national team, usually that fitness level peaks late 20s. Although it's been proven time and time again with, watching the Olympics, that particularly with Europeans, that many of them, it is actually their career. And so they continue doing it, particularly the men, through their 30s. It's not uncommon. But keep in mind that when you're watching any of the Olympics or World Championships in the rowing division, many of them are what are considered genetic freaks, are very gifted with a extremely low VO2 max. So they're not burning the lactic acid that many average people doing the same type of race plan. If that makes any sense. They're genetically just born at an ability to not build a lot of lactic acid. They're not feeling the amount of pain in the muscles that the average person would. And that's that you're born with it or you're not. It's not something you develop.
And then you joined this sport, what you would consider late in the process.
Right.
Your teammates, your friends, when had they discovered crew?
Many of them had been rowing in high school. Again, in Pittsburgh, none of the high schools had the sport of rowing when I was growing up. In fact, we didn't even have lacrosse or field hockey. That's how behind we were. And again, I didn't know anything about the sport. So many of them had grown up throughout the United States and had already been, particularly if they were in the Northeast area, had already been involved in the sport of rowing, or had been involved in some sort of sport and then joined rowing their freshman year of college. But they definitely had a significant amount of time. Now, I had been involved in organized sports since the age of 7. And then I had also been involved in dancing, ballet, jazz, and then later tap, starting at the age of 5. So very much like the gymnast. I was too big to be a gymnast, so that was out of the question. And then later too big to be a dancer. But yeah, I had been involved my entire life, in an organized sport, gratefully.
And then reading through your story, you attribute endurance running to eventually making that kind of shift to being a good rower. What do you think is the overlap?
It's the endurance running. There are several combinations. the endurance running. So I had been running as an endurance athlete since high school, my freshman year of high school. So I had built up that endurance for a long period of time as I even continued to grow. I went through another growth spurt in college where I grew another couple inches, and then I finally filled out. It took me that long to fill out for my body to look like a female. So rather than, this 10-year-old girl, 10 or 8-year-old girl. So that running really attributed to having that built-in base from running really helped me out in terms of transitioning then into the sport of rowing and having to complete the endurance type of workouts that were offered. But I will also say from my own observation that those that had been competitive swimmers really had a shoe in the sport because of their extreme lung development, much more than a marathon runner. It was almost as though they had like a third reserve lung in their system, and their VO2 max was also extremely low. So it was my observation too that there were people that maybe had swam in college or swam in high school and then went to college and started rowing and did extraordinarily well. So I had the opportunity to train with people like that as well. So it allows for a smoother transition into the sport. And then what helped me on the balance end were all those years of dancing, because of taking ballet repeatedly, I had my core already established. So when I had to sit in a fiberglass boat that weighed 27 pounds and there's big me getting in there and all of a sudden I have to balance it, it didn't take me as long to grasp balancing as somebody else that didn't have that ability to know their center from dancing.
What do you think is the muscle group that is most trained for success when you're a rower? I mean, is it the core? Is it shoulders? Is it legs?
So the brain. It's such if we're looking at it from a biological standpoint, it's your quads and your glutes and then your lower back. That whole area needs to be extremely strong. You really need to have a strong core. And I can speak from experience where I had been a runner. I started out in the sport, and the coach I had at the time had me doing a lot of upper body work just to build the upper body because my legs were already really strong, but she didn't focus on the core. And that's a problem area in my family. We have what's called the Gardner gut. It's part of the genetics. And so she didn't focus on that. So what happened? I herniated a disc the first year in. And that's when I ended up starting to swim on just a workout level. I had never swam competitively, but that's another reason why I say swimming is a great sport to be involved in prior to rowing, is because once I started swimming, my lung capacity became much greater. And so transitioning then back into the sport after herniating a disc and being on the bench for 6 months really helped. My legs were skinny. My body was huge. I had reversed, but the core strength is really significant. I mean, in any sport, it's significant, but particularly in rowing.
So what's the monetary buy-in of rowing?
The buy-in, a burning passion to be involved in it. It is an amateur sport. It was back when I was involved. I don't know at this point in time if any of the U.S. athletes are allowed to take on sponsorship. But I know back when I was involved, particularly friends that ended up moving on to the Olympics, it is an amateur sport. So you are self-funding your whole career. The U.S. governing body does offer an annual small salary to some, but at the end of the day, you really have to have that burning desire to do it. It's got to come from your heart and your soul. And again, that's another thing I think that drove me to the sport. It wasn't about any money that was going to be earned.
let's talk technique. There are kind of two types of rowers. Can you break them down for me?
Sure. So there's sweep rowing. And what that means is each rower has one oar that they use to leverage their body weight, leverage the boat horizontally through the water. The key with rowing successfully on a technique level is, and physics, is you want the boat to just travel at a horizontal level with little vertical movement. So the sweep is with one oar, and an easy way to remember that is sweeping with a broom, right? You just use one broom. But then there's sculling, which is SCULLING, and that's when you use two oars, and they're much smaller in length as well as circumference compared to the sweeping oar.
And then how do you know which one you are good at?
From my experience, the coach tells you that. Again, when I was rowing at Drexel, I did sweeping. I did have an opportunity to also do some sculling in the area. But from my experience, when I was training, you had to be involved in both. And actually both work hand in hand. It's like if you participate in, say, basketball, and then you're going to transition, say, into playing volleyball, believe it or not, the skill set that you have for playing basketball is transferable to volleyball. And it's transferable to softball. So the skill set that you're gaining by rowing, say, again, in that 27-pound single boat, it is transferable to when you get into a large boat with 8 people in it, rowing with just the 2x4. So that was pretty much the prerequisite back when I started, was you needed to prove yourself in the sculling boat in order to be considered for any team boat.
Let's talk about that team atmosphere. You are functioning as an individual on your part of the boat, but you're also working completely in sync with other people. How did that process work? Getting to know and be on the exact same page as these other people.
I can't speak for anyone else, but for me, again, that dance background really helped out with that transition, because I was used to having to learn choreography and be in sync with everyone else that was dancing in a performance, and having to go along with the music and stay in tempo with the music, and manage all the different types of choreography, from, you're dancing and you're standing to all of a sudden you're on the floor and you're doing movements on the floor. So it came naturally for me. Again, it was strictly because of having all that dance experience. I was able to understand how to follow someone in front of me, as though I'm actually photocopying them exactly to what they're doing. And I also had very good coaching from the start of rowing, where I didn't have time to make bad habits. I'm sure I had some, but they weren't that big that they held me back. Do you know what I mean? I had very, very good technical coaching, particularly along Boathouse Row. Very good.
And then how much of the direction are you actually listening to, or do you have some kind of cadence in your head once you start a race?
Oh, in the boat, there's what's called a stroke meter, and it's an electronic device that actually counts your rowing strokes. And as I was explaining to someone yesterday, all the races pretty much have some sort of prescribed race plan that rowers, the team, whether you're in a boat or you're rowing individually, will stick to throughout that 2,000 meters. 2,000 meters is the equivalent of 1.25 miles. So when you have the race plan and the prescribed stroke rates and that stroke rating meter, the individual that sits actually in the stroke of the boat, so that would be the stern section of the boat, not the bow, will have that meter in front of them to gauge. to follow through on that stroking. And then it's just everyone else's job sitting behind them to stick with them. And that stroke rating can shift throughout a race, starting, as high as say 37 or close to 40, and then it can shift down to say 32, but then it'll go back up again. But it's very important. And then if you have in a boat with 8 people and there's actually a coxswain in there, that individual will also be navigating down the course.
In the event that you need to speed up as a team, how quickly does that message get relayed?
Within a couple strokes, literally. If you're in a sculling boat, for example, with 4 people, usually the person that's in what's called 2 seat, so that's the person that's the second seat from the bow, will be giving the race plan commentary. And that's the individual that's going to then command to the individual stroking to go ahead and shift the rating. And then everyone just does it in sync simultaneously. So it's as though we're all rowing as one, or at least we should be rowing as though we're one. Not 4 sets of blades, but literally one set of blades.
So what does it feel like when the entire boat is in sync?
When it's in sync and you are completely in sync with your teammates, it almost feels effortless. There's not as much energy that's being used up at that time. An example of that would be, for example, a figure skater, professional figure skater. Look how easy they make it look on the ice. To just sort of glide along, and they're doing their twists and jumps and everything of that nature. You want the rowing stroke, particularly in a team boat, to feel that, excuse me, effortless. Now, don't get me wrong, we are exerting a lot of effort. The heart rates are definitely nearing max, if not at anaerobic threshold. But if you're really in sync, it makes the boat on a physics level feel as though you're not working quite as hard as you are. There's a sort of a high that you get from it, different than the running high. But that's one of the reasons I stuck with it, was when you're working with people, all different backgrounds, body types, you're all with the same goal of getting to the finish line first, and you're in sync. It's incredible feeling. There's a natural high to it.
And then, can you talk me through your career? So you started at Drexel. What came next?
Then I went to that pre-elite training camp. And then after that, I got offered to go to the sculling camp full time, or stay at where I was at. But I had to finish up some schoolwork, so I needed to go back to Philadelphia. So I didn't. I later on then transitioned to training at a team center during periodic times. It wasn't throughout the year. Some people lived and trained at a national team training center, but because I had to self-fund it myself, I didn't have that luxury. I needed to be able to work. I was working on a career path in addition to rowing. So my main spot was on Boathouse Row to train, and there was plenty of talent there to work with. But then at times I would be invited to a training center and I would do a training there. So,
and then how did your kind of background in psych help you work through these team environments?
Well, I hadn't, interestingly enough, done much sports psychology reading. I had a background in my undergraduate as psychology, and I also studied food science and nutrition, because I didn't know if I wanted to, early on, I didn't know if I wanted to become a psychiatrist or if I wanted to become a dietitian, but I studied both. But I will say that having just sort of the basis of the psychology degree did help me. It certainly piqued my interest to, on the side, read sports psychology books. In fact, I've got in the basement, I've got a plastic container filled of sports psychology books that have underlining in them and dog ears and all that stuff. So I actively use. So it's pretty much, I believed in it. I'll say that wholeheartedly. I believed in it. So it made it easy for me to read about it and take that information with me whenever I would be training.
So you're training so much and also learning about nutrition. How many calories would you approximate that you are consuming per day?
Well, I was of a heavyweight division, so there was not a weight restriction for us. The key for me, as well as other women, is we had to keep our weight up, so to speak. So I was weighing about at 160 pounds to 165. That was my fluctuation. But the coach wanted me at 175. So a lot of us kind of ate anything under the sun. I'm not going to know the exact number of calories. It was certainly 5,000 or more. But let me just give you sort of a visual idea. It was not hard for me to order a medium pizza and eat all of that myself, and then pull out the gallon of ice cream that's in the freezer and then eat half of it in one sitting, because my body just needed that fuel. It was not hard for me to boil a pound of pasta and eat half of that box in one sitting, because again, my body needed as much fuel, both complex carbohydrates as well as the protein, in order to complete those workouts. I ate far more in rowing than I ever did in running, in track or distance running. So yeah, it's just about anything under the sun. But that's from my experience. And then there's also a lightweight division of rowing, which I do want to touch on. And that's, I don't know where the weight requirements are now, but I know for men it used to be 160 pounds or less, and women 130 or less. And that in itself is a different ball game. And I always applaud the lightweights, rowers, particularly when they're able to, if not keep up with heavyweight rowers on a race course, but actually beat them, because there's a whole element of sensible dieting that they have to really stick to on a day-to-day basis, not just prior to an event, but it's something that they have to be conscious of at all times, particularly if they're not genetically predisposed to normally be at those weights. You know, they tend to be a little heavier, but they have to diet down. Completely different ballgame. Always amazed at the people that were of the lightweight division, whether it's male or female. And I would stand on the sidelines and I'd watch them racing against the heavier weights, which is my division, and I'd see them just keep up and sometimes beat them. So, but you know, I couldn't imagine the calories, having to watch the calories the way they did, because I was hungry all the time. I mean, at one point I stood on the scale with my late coach, Igor Grinko, who had passed several years ago, and I had a piece of that hoagie in my hand because he kept saying, you need to eat more, you need to gain more weight. And I'm like, how about this? We exchange a workout for me to actually just eat instead, because I just couldn't do it. Some people, it was just your work training so much that you can't gain the weight. It's almost impossible.
Wow.
Unless you're older, and as you know, when you get older, then your body tends to hold on to weight. You don't lose it as easily, particularly when you get past 40. But yeah, for many of us, it was just hard to keep the weight on because you're training all the time. You're living to eat.
That's crazy.
Too.
So then after that kind of 2 to 3 years post college, how did rowing manifest in your life?
It was a lifestyle, and I ended up, meeting extraordinary people who, at the time, many of them were getting their master's degree, were going to law school, or were going to medical school, in addition to training, and their goals, of course, were to compete at the Olympic level. So I got to meet really extraordinary people who are still living various parts throughout the world, and still having very fulfilling lives. So that in itself was very rewarding for me, because they often say you meet your lifelong friends in college, and I did, but then I met more later on in rowing. So, but it was a lifestyle. You got up in the morning, sometimes before the sun was up, and you were out rowing, training for a couple hours, and then, like myself and many others, we had to work, and then you leave work and you head back down and do whatever prescribed training is there. So it is a lifestyle. There used to be a T-shirt I owned that I remember seeing in college that said, "I can't, I gotta row." And that was so true. I couldn't, I gotta row. Well, in fact, when I retired, many of my friends from high school or college all of a sudden had families, they had gray hair, they were living a completely different lifestyle. And I was like, wow, I missed out on that. I didn't realize just how locked in I was in this very small world, compared to the rest of the world of people the same age.
So how old were you when you retired?
I was 29, because it was December of 99.
And then what happened to make you retire?
I wasn't getting any faster. I had been overtrained all the time. And the reason I knew I was overtrained was we had been trained, many of us have been trained to monitor our resting heart rate. And what that means is when you get up in the morning, you check your heart rate. And we would usually use a special device to get it correct, to find out the number. So I had a heart rate monitor. So I had a polar heart rate monitor, and I would always get up in the morning and it'd be close to 100. And even going to bed at night, I could hear my heart pounding. And I was tired all of the time. But at the same time, that was part of the lifestyle. So there was a fine line for me to figure out, am I overtrained? Am I just been overtrained for too many months, maybe more than a year? Or is my body just shutting down? There was just such a vague area, but at the end of the day, I just wasn't performing. I had reached my peak and I wasn't going any faster. I certainly knew I wasn't anywhere near being able to make the Olympic team. And to be honest, I didn't want to spend another 4 years to try to earn a berth on the team. Like 5 years was enough. Short, extraordinary, but that was enough of that. So that's part of the reason why I stopped. But another significant one, which I mentioned in the book, is that last race I had in December of 99. It was an informal race called the Speed Order, and it took place on Langley Pond in South Carolina. When I was sitting at the starting line, I literally heard sort of a gut voice say to me, "You're done. This will be your last race." Now, whether it was, God, the universe, a higher power, all I knew is that that was going to be my last race. And I got through the finish line, and I explained in detail within the book, that whole situation. And that was it. I knew I was just done. It was time to move on. And it's a challenging transition for any athlete, particularly when they've made it their lifestyle, to go from that point to moving on to a new chapter in life. But that's really when I knew it was like, all right, this is enough. This is, wasting my time. And I also was approaching 30. And so when any individual, male or female, is about to approach a new decade, you tend to start thinking about in the back of your mind, what do I want to accomplish? What do I want? How do I see my life? And I had already been doing that the year prior.
And then before I ask another question, I'm going to shut this one down because we only have a minute and a half left. And then the same information that I just sent will work again.
Great.
Awesome. So you retire from rowing, and then you turn 30, and a month after you turn 30, you get diagnosed with cancer.
Yeah, so it was actually a year after I retired from the sport of rowing. I got diagnosed. It was literally 1 month after my 30th birthday, and 3 weeks before I was to run probably my first and only marathon. So I was still in decent shape. In fact, I had been comfortably running up to 15 miles, fully knowing that with running a marathon, you hit some sort of wall. And I was accepting that would happen. And I was willing to complete those 26 miles. So that's interesting to me on a level of training, what the body is capable of doing, even when they already have a 2.8 centimeter tumor inside of them, and they don't know it.
It's just fascinating to me that I'm listening to you here to talk about this, because there was an interview that I did somewhere in the 50s of this episode, and it was a Team USA cross country skier, and she won Team USA's first gold medal in her sport at the Olympics. And then like a month or two later, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And she was like, I won an Olympic medal with breast cancer inside, like already working at me. And it sounds like your story was probably similar.
Pretty much, it sounds like it. Yeah, when you're a picture of good health and you get diagnosed with something that's not in the gene pool, it's all the more shocking. It sends you really into a tailspin, particularly when your mind is now programmed. Like I said, in my 30s, I had already been projecting what I wanted to do next, and that this, of all things, just came out of the blue. It would have been like me diagnosed with diabetes. It wouldn't have been possible because although I was eating a lot, and I did say earlier that we eat everything under the sun, it's within reason. I mean, we had to eat healthy because if we didn't, it would affect our performance, and not in a positive way. I had experiences eating a Philly cheesesteak and then going out for a row, and that didn't work out. So yeah. So I had been consciously eating healthy at the same time.
And then stage 3.
Right. All the more of a jolt, because it's not stage 1. It's a different ballgame. It's stage 3. So I really had to sit and pull over sort of in my life, pull over to the shoulder if I was driving on a highway, and the highway of life, and really process that. Like it was more than just stage 1, where sometimes they just have to get radiation and then they move on with life. It was stage 3. So that meant it went through the lymph node, which made me think, oh my God, is it somewhere else? Is it in my lungs? But it is interesting, the strength of the human mind and how it can still perform at an extremely strenuous level. I mean, a marathon I was only planning on doing one and one only, because of my size. I'm not genetically predisposed to run a marathon. I'm Clydesdale in the running world. So I didn't want to put that type of a challenge onto my body, particularly my joints. So yeah, it was jolting, to say the least. Not just for me, but for, of course, the family as well.
And
because
then,
it's in the DNA.
right, I mean, you had no family history of breast cancer.
No, and I did research it. I scoured the Northern Irish side, and I scoured the Swedish side. It was nowhere. I literally scoured the gene.
And then 12 rounds of chemo.
Right. So for me, that was probably a lot easier than those that had not already been competing and training at such a grueling level. Because again, I was fortunate to have been training with U.S. national team coaches, although I never earned a berth on the U.S. team. That's okay. I had been conditioned to train at that level. My mind and my body was already conditioned from rowing to beat that battle, to withstand the challenges of having chemotherapy, which truly does break down your whole body. I went literally from a size 12, which I've always been pretty much a size 12. I went all the way up to a 1X within 1 month. So all those years of heavy lifting, growing that whole muscular system that's developed, takes years to develop. It was gone after a couple rounds of chemotherapy. It just turned to fat. Felt like a big blob of slush. So that was interesting to me as well on a biology sort of level, just how the body just immediately changed from
And
taking
then
chemotherapy.
how did you stay active during chemo?
Well, as probably most endurance athletes, whether they're marathon runners, triathlete throwers, we're hardwired to work out each day. It's like brushing our teeth. You do it. You want to do it. Particularly when you're sort of born to move. You're born to be an athlete. So for me, walking and lightly jogging, I didn't mind doing. In fact, I was determined to do it. Although it was extremely humbling because I had all of a sudden been able to training for a marathon. And because of the chemotherapy effect on my lungs, my ability to transport oxygen throughout my body was depleted. It was harder for me. My body had to work all the harder for me to carry it, taking running strides. So I ended up doing a lot more walking compared to running. Sometimes I do a walk run. I actually talk about that in the book. It's the humbling effect of all of a sudden you're used to be able to throw on those tennis shoes, grab whatever you're going to listen to music to, and you're out the door, and you're just doing a little stretching, run up, and you go. And all of a sudden, I couldn't go. I had to stop. I had to walk. And I wasn't of the mindset of walking, except if I was walking throughout the city of Philadelphia to get to a certain destination, then I would walk. So it was extremely humbling to have to downshift to just being able to walk. I occasionally picked up weights, and I will say that those years of weight training paid off in helping me to move through the transition of receiving chemotherapy constantly. But there is something to be said about being physically active in life and the fact that it can provide you dividends should, in the unfortunate event that you get sick. So I was living off those sort of dividends of being an endurance athlete.
And then how did the mindset that you have to have as an elite athlete, and even specifically in endurance athlete, help with getting through all of the chemo that you had to go through?
Fortunately, because of self-funding my education at Drexel University and then having to self-fund my career for throwing, and had pretty much been raised to be a sort of do-it-yourself, fund-it-yourself type of individual, that transition to having to be my own CEO, CFO, COO of that journey, solely being responsible for it, was not that challenging. It was just, it took away some extra energy that I needed. So it was very natural for me to budget and change my budget and focus on the insurance bills as well as my life bills, my lifestyle bills, housing stuff of that nature. I didn't have a problem with that because I've been doing that all my life. So yeah, that was fine. I did work full time. I had my chemotherapy on the weekend so that I could rest after receiving it Saturday through Sunday. So then I could then go back to work with more of a quote unquote fresh mind, or as fresh as it could be. It got harder towards the last few treatments of chemotherapy. I do know that I had that chemo brain, which is probably very similar to having senior moments. I do know that my body particularly with the last round of chemotherapy, it didn't take all the way through. It was so saturated, my veins were like, no more. So I only had half of it, but then I just figured, well, I have what I'm supposed to have. I don't need any more of this. But yeah, that again, I think my upbringing, having had a special needs brother, and then having been raised by parents that trained you to be sort of a do-it-yourself kid, uh, lended itself to that. To many people, it would seem like a lot, but for me, it was just a lifestyle. It's what I knew, you know.
Let's talk about your brother. You quote him quite frequently as being an inspiration to you.
Correct.
Why is that?
Well, he was born in 1964 with cerebral palsy. I do have a little picture of him here, which I think I've sent you as well. But back in that era, a lot of times when someone was born with special needs, they were immediately put into home. Families didn't always choose to raise them, or they would have a professional come in to help out with them. So my mother at the time had been a new nurse out of UPMC here in Pittsburgh, for Children's Hospital. So she obviously chose to raise him with my father. They made a concerned decision that, we're going to raise him like any other kid. He's going to be treated special, but at the same time, we're going to try to raise him as normally as possible. So he was born with cerebral palsy. Fast forward to 1988, his left lung collapsed. So he had literally one functioning right lung to basically provide body oxygen throughout his body, which made him susceptible in winter months to getting colds. He was on a nebulizer. He had COPD. He was diagnosed with a slight form of mental retardation, but anyone who's ever been around him know that he's probably average level intelligence. He had a number of leg surgeries early on in his life. He wore leg braces similar to, if not identical, to the ones that Forrest Gump wore early in the movie. And then my brother Todd also wore a Milwaukee back brace through high school because he had scoliosis. So when you're growing up with someone in the household who has ongoing medical needs, and it sometimes has to get rushed to the ER for one reason or another, that set the bar for me on how life can be challenging. So because he was such an inspiration, and he's also part of the reason why I got involved in the sport of rowing, or got involved in any athletic activity, was because I was able to do something that I knew he couldn't. So I would do it for him in spirit. And in fact, all the rowing medals that I had earned once I moved back to Pittsburgh, I actually gave them all to him. There was one medal that I actually buried him with back in April 2020, when we laid him to rest. But he had set the bar to, this is how you live a normal life with all the challenges that he had. And so when you have that, my bad day when receiving chemotherapy is equivalent to his every day. So there's no room for me to complain. Just rest and get back into the game. For me, I approached the cancer battle, particularly getting the treatment, as though it was an athletic event. And that, again, being that raised as an athlete, being hardwired as an endurance athlete, really attributed to me being able to, okay, this is the mindset. I'm in a new game. This is the game of life. There's no room for error. This is the make it or you're gonna die. Figure this out, get through it, or you're gonna die. There's the final only. That's the word I was looking for. It's the final only. So yeah, he was, if anything, always in the back of my mind, because again, he had set the bar. This is how you go through life with handicaps. All right, well, this is how you go through life with cancer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Relating to your diagnosis, what did the doctors tell you?
I got diagnosed when I was driving to work on 611 in North Philadelphia, not far from Albert Einstein Hospital. And anyone listening familiar with Philadelphia would know sort of the area where I'm talking about. It's very urban. You drive with your windows up, your doors locked, you stay focused on what's going on. And it's rush hour. So I received a call. I'm in my Volkswagen Fox. It's got a stick shift. I've got my stainless steel Starbucks mug filled with coffee, and the phone rings. I pull it out of the console. It's my surgeon, and she's telling me that the biopsy had turned out that I had cancer. And at this point, I'm literally in the left-hand lane, again in North Philly. And I know that I need to get to the right lane and then find somewhere to pull over. But it's 611 is predominantly, it's not a highway, but they certainly do move at a fast speed at times, particularly during the rush hour. So thanks to being an athlete, once again, I was able to sort of calmly hang up the phone and then just drive to the right lane. And then I found the Sunoco, which sat in the middle of 611. And I pulled over there just to sort of take a breath, collect myself. Because I was in my athletic mindset at that. And again, thanks to the coaching that I had, thanks to these extraordinary people that I'd been training with, that whole experience really helped me in terms of just sort of regrouping at the Sunoco, in a less favorable environment. So yeah, it was a bit of a jolt. I remember calling my mother right away from the Sunoco because she knew at that point what was going on. And I gave her the information, and then I had to hang up because I had to get to work and then figure out from there, the steps we had to take.
And what were those steps? I mean, you had no prior understanding of really anyone who had cancer or how you were going to deal with it. You didn't have a roadmap, and stage 3 was certainly not expected.
I would have loved to just have a roadmap earlier in life in general, but I always used to say, it'd be nice to see a blueprint of what God has planned for you. Just a glimpse of it so I can get a snapshot of it and know what to expect. Can I just get a blueprint of what you had originally planned? So the next step was, once I got to my office, I ended up contacting the doctor, and then I scheduled a period of time that my mother could come in from Pittsburgh and we could sit with the surgeon to discuss the options. So the options were then lumpectomy, 2 rounds of chemo, and then 1 round of radiation. And mind you, all this time, I'm definitely probably going through shock. But thanks again to being an athlete, I was able to navigate through it. I mean, just driving to work, I don't know how I got there. It's definitely thanks to the universe.
And then June is actually National Cancer Survivor Month.
It is.
How has your journey shifted your perspective on that?
I know wholeheartedly, I know from having looked at statistics 20 years ago, which are somewhat different than what they project now. I know how fortunate I am. So it is because of choosing to actually finally publish this book that I ended up writing between 2001 and 2004, and I didn't intend to publish it then. I hadn't reached the 5-year milestone. I was smart enough to know that it could come back in a decade because it was so aggressive. So I know how fortunate I am. And so it's crystal clear to me from the universe, from God, from a higher power, whatever you want to call it, that this is basically part of my mission in life. The fact of being an athlete, or having gone to university or anything else that had happened prior to is really just a building block for really ultimately what my purpose is. And that's to help continue to motivate cancer patients as well as the caregivers. I do not exclude the caregivers, because I know from my own experience and watching caregivers, not even taking care of me, but other people, as well as the hospital staff, the nurses, the doctors, the physical therapists, that it's all encompassing and all overwhelming for all of them, particularly during a pandemic, which is the reason why I decided to pull out that manuscript. When we had lockdown here in Pittsburgh, it was the last week of March. I don't know where it was for you, but that's when it happened.
I'm actually down in Morgantown, West Virginia.
Okay, gotcha. So yeah, we're close by. So the lockdown procedure, which felt more like shock down to me. And it was once I understood or wrapped my head around what a pandemic was and what exactly was going to happen, that's when I started questioning, how are people that need to go to the hospital going to be able to get their treatments, regardless of what it is? So that's when my intuition kicked in again, very similar to as it did during my last rowing race in December of '99. And it said, pull out that manuscript, go through the editing procedure, which is painstaking for me because I didn't study journalism, nor was I an English lit major. But I got through it and I decided to team up with Amazon Publishing, having had the experience of working with CFPs that had self-published books or had worked with publishing companies. And I contacted Amazon and connected with Alex Roy initially, and then later on with Mike Davidson. So the two of them have been helping navigate that whole publishing experience, which is a journey within itself. But it's been actually a lot of fun for me. The team is actually really wonderful. I have had a lot of laughter going on throughout the entire process, and gotten to know them really well. So they've been helping me. They helped me design the books. I don't have an eye for designing. And then with the editing, and then inserting photos and all that information that was required, they really walked with me, and we worked as a collaboration to get this book out there and globally marketed. Because as we know, cancer is non-discriminatory and it affects every corner of the world.
Let's talk about that 5-year benchmark. What are you looking for past that?
Now that the book is published, or you mean after remission?
Yeah, after the period of time after remission, how frequently are you kind of on guard looking for signs and
So
symptoms?
it goes from every 6 months. So every 6 months for the first 5 years, I was getting a complete bone scan. I was getting, a breast MRI. My entire body was scanned medically to see if there was cancer in any area of it. And that was every 6 months. So then you changed every year. That's how it shifted. But I was so used to going in there that at one point the nurse that was predominantly with me the entire 5 years said to me, I said, can I come back every 6 months for the next 5 years? And I'm like, no, Beth, you can go. You're good for now. Like, it was hard for me. They were my security blanket. It was hard for me to let go. They're like, no, you can't come back every 6 months now. Don't take it personally. So part of that's probably, again, the athlete in me, but I, as a statistic level, I just wanted to make sure that the tests were done. So yeah, it's every year. And having, again, done the research on my own to that level, I was still somewhat on guard, and know that I'm incredibly lucky to be working today. It's definitely because of a higher power, God, that having navigated through that, as well as extended family and friends that have helped me through that.
How long have you been in remission?
21 years officially, 21 and a half.
That's amazing. Let's talk about that support system though. When you were in hospital beds and going through chemo, who were the people who were supporting you?
Well, it was the procedure lumpectomy was done the same day. So I had the lumpectomy in the morning, and then by the afternoon, I was heading home. So I didn't have to stay over for that, which was fine. The chemotherapy I had done through a friend at the time on Saturday. So that's all sort of explained within the book, that journey of getting chemotherapy and everything I went through with that. But I was fortunate because there are particularly two individuals that directed me on the initial stages of the cancer. Both names were Jessica. Ironically, I had met them, one of them, Jessica Cardwell, when I was at Drexel University. She was there. She's actually one of the first people I met when I got involved in sport. And she was working at the University of Pennsylvania at the Abramson Center. So she was the one that directed me to my actual surgeon at Pennsylvania Hospital, as well as the oncologist. Now, I had shopped around literally in Philadelphia area with the top surgeons around to determine which one I would go with. But I knew, having known Jessica well, and I knew from my intuition, the moment I met the breast surgeon at Penn Hospital, Dr. Dalia Sadaloff, I knew she was the one, hands down. It's just, again, another sign from the universe. So Jessica Cardwell is very instrumental. And then the other Jessica Grossnickel, she and her mother, Susan, were instrumental in sort of emotionally checking in on. Susan actually drove me that morning to the procedure with my mother in the back of her car. So she was helpful in many ways. She was always checking in with me, calling me, saying, checking in to see how I was doing, as well as Jessica. So they were also there, which was extremely helpful. And then, I was talking to someone about this yesterday, that when you're going through or about to go through something challenging in life, it's interesting how God will literally put in your life people to help you navigate it long before you even realize that you're headed into a storm. So all of these people, people I knew along Boathouse Row, they had all been in my life for that period of time. And I thought for that reason, for rowing, with Jessica Cardwell, it was the university connection. I thought that was the reason why they were in my life, not because they were going to be instrumental, be rocks, be checking in on me periodically when I was going through the chemo. Would not be coming over to my apartment, which was right near the art museum in Philadelphia, to check in on me. So I thank God, as well as them, for strategically putting these people in my life when, for that specific reason. There's another group of family, and again, God will put people in your life if they're not from the same religious background, they're a different race, they're from a different culture. It's mind-blowing. I could write a book on just the people that have entered into my life for no other reason than God doing it for a specific reason, because he needs them to navigate me through something that's going to be too much for me, for my skill set to be able to figure out. So there was another family from Haldwani, India, East India, roughly about an hour north of New Delhi. So that kind of gives you the geographical, not far from the Himalaya Mountains, if not directly in them. So the Pant family, that's P-A-N-T, P as in Paul, A-T, that family of four, I had met right before retiring from the sport of rowing. I had met their oldest son, Rajiv, when I was working at Philly.com, and just on the tail end of my rowing career. And I also met his brother, Vic, during that same time. They had lived in Philadelphia, and then because their parents would travel from India to Philadelphia to visit periodically, I got the parents. And hands down, that family was like an extended family. Their parents were like my extended parents, in the sense of, they were there to emotionally, check in on at all times. They had a complete pulse on the situation. So if anything, not only does God put people into your life from a wide range of areas throughout the world, but it just also shows the power of prayer and how significant it is, regardless of where it's coming from, whether it's coming from Hindu culture, whether it's coming from a Catholic church, whether it's coming from a Jewish temple. regardless of the religion, I personally believe that the power of prayer um, it helps. It's vital.
And then how did writing the book change your sense of perceived self-worth with the story that your life has been?
Well, I started out writing a journal. And the reason I started out writing into a journal is because that's what the oncologist nurses recommended. So there I am, the athlete. I'm looking at them like the coaches. So I started writing a journal. And then I was continuing to write the journal. That's when it dawned on me, this could be a book. But again, I didn't study journalism. I didn't study American Lit. It just wasn't my calling. So I started to transfer the journal into a book. Again, it was from 2001 to 2004. So that in itself was very therapeutic. Without me fully realizing how therapeutic, just being able to put it down on and type it in, to a Word document was very therapeutic for me. And 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I still have to say, regardless of the fact that I had not reached remission, and I still had 10 years sort of to go to hit that milestone, even though I still probably wasn't of the mindset to publish something like that. It wasn't of my personality. So it's because of having done the actual work psychologically on a metaphysics level to understand why I attracted a non-hereditary disease like cancer. That's how, because I took the time to understand why I actually attracted the disease, took the time to pull out all of the toxic roots that were associated to that disease. That has enabled me to get to this place today where I'm comfortable with publishing a book. I was not comfortable with doing it beforehand. And society would not have probably accepted it.
Wow.
So it's to society changing as well, where more people are coming out. I look at a job application, it's asking me, are you transgender? Are you Latin? All these questions that are asked now that are far more in detail than something, say, 20 years ago I would have done. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey. I recommend to everyone that they write a book once in their life. You'll learn a lot about yourself, whether it's a cookbook, regardless of what type of book. I do recommend people doing it because I've gone down the path, and again, it wasn't my original career path. But yeah, it's an interesting journey. You learn a lot about yourself.
We've reached the end of my questions. Is there anything about your story that you think that I've missed? We still have about 5.5 minutes before we get cut off. Anything that I missed about your story? Anything that you wanted to put more emphasis on?
Yes, I do. And I stumbled around it just a couple minutes ago, but I chose to take the time to figure out why I attracted that disease. I did that outside of working full-time work. I studied psychology, I studied metaphysics, I did a little bit of biology studying to understand how I attracted it so that I could beat the game of recurrence. That was the name of the game for me. I want to beat the game of recurrence. So the athlete in me chose to venture down that dark path. Now, we know in the United States alone, or North American continent, that, for example, anyone that struggles with addiction, there are so many different facilities they can go, people can go that struggle with addiction to get clean, to get the help they need. I mean, you can go to an exotic island to get clean. So although I'm not an addict, and although, that was not my challenge, I took that responsibility to do an actual deep dive into my own life to figure out not only how I got it, but how to prevent it from happening again. Because I knew the chemotherapy and the radiation were indeed helpful. But at the same time, I knew intuitively and intellectually that there was more to it than just that. So what this book does is it helps other people to spend the time to do their own sort of deep dive in their personal lives, to figure out how they can cure their own bodies. Because we can make ourselves sick, but at the same time, the beauty of the human body is we can make ourselves well. So that's the huge takeaway.
Yeah. Your episode will come out on July 13th. So you have about a month before that happens. If anything changes between now and then that you want added to the script, please just send me a direct message on LinkedIn. I can add whatever you want. If there are any resources that you'd like me to put in the show notes, I can put links to all of those. With that, any other questions?
No, I do realize at points of time I'm stumbling. So if you want to edit through that, feel free.
Yeah.
Just because this was a lengthy one for me.
Yeah.
So although I had
No,
done,
you did well.
Yeah, I really, that last part that I just reiterated, that's really the take home
Yeah.
from this book,
Yeah.
is I did the work. And other people are, unfortunately, they're gonna have to do the work in addition to receiving treatment if they really want to get through it. So that's the big takeaway. But yeah, I will keep that in mind. I made myself a note, July the 13th.
Yes.
And I will send you additional resources. I sent you a ton of pictures and stuff. You don't have to use any of that. I really wanted to just plug people's names, particularly the family of 4 and then the 2 Jessicas.
Yes.
As well.
Awesome.
And if you need any information, I posted on my Facebook as well as the LinkedIn, my interview from last night, different questions. Some of them were similar, but I think
turnaround one.
I think it'd be wise for you to look at it just for your development of this final product.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, I think we're going to go for today, and I'll talk to you in a month once this is published. I hope you love it. Thank you for spending time with me today.
Sure. Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye.